Good afternoon. Well, I was asked to talk about the issue of refugees in the context of the Syrian war. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes so that I have available to me is to look in a little bit of factual detail at each of the countries that has taken in large Syrian refugee populations and examine the relevant issues therein. And then I'm going to look at the issue of IDPs, that's to say internally displaced persons who, as I'll go on to outline, constitute the majority of Syrians who've left their homes in the course of the last 6 years of civil war. And then I'll briefly go on at the end to look at outlook and options, so to speak, both with regard to the refugee issue and with regard to the Syrian war as a whole. Well, in 2016, the United Nations identified 13.5 million Syrians requiring humanitarian assistance, of which more than 6 million are internally displaced, and over 4.8 million are refugees outside of Syria. This is from a total population in Syria of 22.85 million in 2013. So it's a massive proportion of the Syrian population that has left its homes or left their homes in the course of the war. There's also, of course, a large but unknown number of unregistered refugees. So you can be certain that the real number is considerably higher even than that already very high number. And Turkey is the largest country, or rather the largest host country of refugees, with nearly 3 million refugees registered at the end of 2016. And major populations also exist in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, and additional sizable populations in Egypt, and also in Europe, of course, with the greatest number in Germany and a large number also in Sweden. The political implications of the presence of these refugees, in my estimation at least, is dependent on three factors broadly. Firstly, the economic strength or weakness of the country in question. Secondly, its size. And thirdly, and perhaps most interestingly, the issue of the cultural compatibility, so to speak, of the population of newcomers compared to the host population. And in this regard, it's fairly obvious that, at least as far as the region is concerned, Turkey is the best equipped country to receive newcomers, and unsurprisingly, Turkey has created the most organized infrastructure for the refugee population living in within its borders, and perhaps also unsurprisingly, the least organized and perhaps least suitable country in the region to receive a large refugee population, which it has, is Lebanon. Lebanon, also because of the dysfunctional political system of the country, also because of its small population, and of course, interestingly, also because of the overwhelmingly Sunni Arab allegiances of the refugees from Syria, is perhaps the one most potentially seriously impacted by the influx of refugees. A little bit of detail there on each country before I move on to the issue of IDPs. The specific number, for those of you who are interested in numbers, I looked it up, so we try and prepare ourselves for these things, of Syrian refugees registered in Turkey at the end of 2016 is 2,724,937 people, which you won't remember, but what you should remember is that's a very, very large number of people, very obviously, and the interestingly additional large number is that around 30% of the population live in 22 government-run camps near the Syrian border. I've visited a number of those camps and interviewed refugees there, and certainly there's a hierarchy of camps now, from the ones established immediately after the beginning of the war in Syria to those established later. Certainly in the ones established most early on, conditions are not great, but are certainly adequate, and the life that is lived there by those Syrians is certainly acceptable, so to speak. And as one works one way down, one gets to more and more difficult situations, leading now to a situation, of course, where many of the most recent refugees work and live outside of the camps, working in the informal economy, often subject to potential exploitation, and so on and so forth. Why is this the case that the initial investment has not led to a similar subsequent investment? Well, debatable, of course, but I think one should note the fact that if we can talk about the Syrian war as a question of backing which horse and which not to back, the Turks, as it turns out, backed the wrong horse. That's to say, not morally speaking, or ethically speaking, but simply practically speaking. They backed the Sunni Arab rebels. They assumed, as did many other people too, including our former defense minister here, Ehud Barak, that the regime of Assad would fall very quickly. It didn't happen, and indeed many people would now agree, and I'm one of them, that the Sunni Arab rebellion in Syria has effectively been eclipsed, has effectively been strategically defeated, and it's on its way right now to being rolled up. Secondly, let me just mention the issue of refugees in Jordan. 628,000 refugees registered in Jordan, but a Jordanian census carried out in November 2015 shows there are in fact around 1.4 million Syrians living in the country, which means that around 50% of those refugees are unregistered. This has cost the Jordanians a massive amount of money. It's costing them around $2.5 billion a year. This is a country, of course, in great economic difficulties, and this has led some analysts, at least who know Jordan well, to see the refugees as a kind of time bomb in the country, which must inevitably have some major political fallout. Those of you who spent some time in Amman, and I spend some time in Amman every now and then, will be aware of the thickness of population of Syrians that you just run into, empirically speaking, so to speak. If you spend your time in the low-rent neighborhoods of Amman, anybody you meet in a cafe or elsewhere is as likely to be a Syrian as anybody else. And this impact they've had, not only on the big camps in the north, not only in the northern cities of Jordan, but also in the capital, is something which I think is worth noting. Iraq, I'll just mention 245,000 population in Iraq, many of them in Iraqi Kurdistan. Again, the Kurdish government has set up a number of refugee camps, and here again we have the issue of sectarian identity. I've interviewed a number of KRG, Kurdish regional government politicians, who are concerned about the same kind of issues in a way which affect Israel, concerned about the issue of demographic balance, namely that the KRG is busy trying to create a Kurdish state, and because of the influx of nearly 250,000 Arab refugees, the issue now is becoming one in which, well, who are we establishing a Kurdish state for? Will it be actually a Kurdish state, or one containing a very large and perhaps difficult to absorb population of potential Arab citizens as well, also from Syria, and of course some also from the unrest in Iraq. Just lastly, and as in terms of the countries in question, and to mention Israel, of course, not really any appreciable number of refugees taken in. The Interior Ministry just announced on 20th January that Israel will take in around 100 unaccompanied Syrian refugee children. But at the same time, Israeli humanitarian groups have been active across the border since the beginning of the conflict. Around 2,000 Syrians injured in the war have been treated in Israeli hospitals, and there is, of course, an ongoing tacit relationship between Israel and the rebel groups east of Quneitra, which involves also aid being provided to the civilian population in those areas. Outside of the region, of course, as I mentioned, the largest population is in Germany. The issue is threatened and is still threatening to disrupt European politics. My estimation, at least, is that it's much too soon to start drawing any conclusions about what this might mean for European politics in the longer term. I think the implications may well be very major indeed, but we can already at least do some empirical research regarding the issue of the danger of Islamist terror groups utilizing the refugee flow to introduce their members into European countries. And there have already been a number of terrorist attacks plotted by Syrian refugees affiliated with ISIS, which have been frustrated, and indeed also a number of, unfortunately, terror attacks that have been carried out. In July 2016, for example, a Syrian refugee killed a woman with a machete near Stuttgart. In the same month, a Syrian asylum seeker blew himself up at a music festival, and so on and so forth. Clearly, the vast majority of refugees coming to Europe mean to escape violence, not to carry it with them to Europe. But nevertheless, there is undoubtedly an emergent issue of this attempt by terror organizations to utilize the refugee flow in order to introduce their members into the European population. Secondly, and second to lastly, the issue of internally displaced persons. Again, around 6.5 million people, the general estimate is, including 2.8 million children. This is considered to be the biggest internally displaced population in the world. This is a much more murky issue than that of refugees who have left Syria. Quite simply, Syrians trapped inside their own country simply don't have the same rights and protections that refugees do on the other side of the border. Refugees who leave a country and go to another one, of course, entitled to aid, asylum procedures, and so on. Internally displaced people exist within a much weaker legal rights framework. And in a situation in which the legal government, so to speak, in the country in question is a thing like the Assad regime, you can imagine this is a less than ideal situation for internal refugees. This is compounded, according to human rights groups and refugee monitors, by the fact that the lack of access to much of Syria, because it's in the midst of civil war, means it's very difficult to really find accurate information about what refugees need, and of course also to bring aid to them. One thing which I think is worth noting, though, especially with regard to the fact that this morning we were talking about the issue of Assad's and his regime's ethnic cleansing, supposedly of parts of Syria, is the fact, undoubtedly, that the vast majority of internally displaced persons in the Syrian conflict have made their way to the government side, to the regime side, not to the rebel-controlled areas. The reason is obvious, and it's because if you are a refugee and you want to get somewhere safe where you won't be bombed from the air and maybe even stand some chance of receiving rights of one kind or another from your government, Assad's is the side to be in, not the rebel-controlled sides. But it's worth bearing this in mind because when we talk about depopulation of Sunni population on the hands of the Assad regime, we should note the IDP process is having the opposite effect, namely that Sunni refugees are making their way to the Assad-controlled part of the country, not leaving it. And this is something which I think is important to bear in mind. What about with regard to the future and how this issue is going to be addressed? 13.5 million refugees, to reiterate it, one of the largest refugee issues since World War II, threatening the internal security of neighboring states, potentially threatening the security and social cohesion of the European Union. What's to be done about it? Well, as you are all aware from your close observation of the United States presidential campaign, the issue on everybody's lips right now is that of safe zones. And that is because President, or then candidate Trump, chose to introduce this issue back into the bloodstream of the discussion. He did it in his own inimitable use of the language. He refers to them as big, beautiful safe zones, which are going to be used to give these people a chance. This is a nice sound, and has a nice sound to it, of course. The problem comes when this idea, which is an intuitively sensible idea in many ways, get some refugees to stay in the country, but in a safe area. Problem is when you run into the politics of the Syrian war. And at this point, the politics become unavoidable, and the 5 minutes remaining to me, I'm going to focus on the politics. Look, safe zones. But the problem is that the Iranians and the Assad regime that they back are absolutely opposed to safe zones because they want the way clear for a regime reconquest of the entire country. And the last thing they want to run into is an air force or ground force which is trying to secure a safe zone when they are engaged in doing this. Turkey is sympathetic to the idea of safe zones, especially because it doesn't want to host more refugees, given the impact that that's already had on Turkey, also in terms of terrorist groups, or terrorist attacks rather. And Jordan and Lebanon, as well as the Europeans, favor the idea of safe zones, pretty much for the same reason. The Russian stance in this regard remains absolutely crucial, in my view, for obvious reasons. The problem is, as with so much in Syria, that the Russian stance, at least as far as I can make out, is ambiguous. It's not quite clear if the Russians support the idea, reject the idea, or somewhere in between. In the meantime, a number of pilot schemes have been proposed for the safe zones. And again, looking closely at the Syrian map, you immediately run into problems. One of the proposed schemes was an initial zone lying between Kilis, obviously in Turkey, on the Syrian-Turkish border, and all the way to Reyhanli. That's going through Aleppo and Idlib provinces. The problem there, as all close observers of Syria will know, is that much of that area is in the hands of some of the most extreme jihadi groups. The Tahrir al-Sham group, composed of the former Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and one of the most extreme jihadi groups, are organized and dominant on the ground there. So how exactly do you want to organize a safe zone when it's in the hands of Sunni jihadi groups? The answer is not yet clear. A second, more modest notion is the idea of beginning a safe zone in the area between Jarablus and Azaz, that's to say in the enclave carved out by the Turkish military in recent months. Again, this runs into the politics of the war. You could certainly do that, but if you're the West and you want to do that, does that mean you're then going to be partnering with Turkey and its rebel allies in the war? Well, you could do that, but at the moment, of course, the United States has been mainly allied with a thing it calls the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is based around the Kurdish YPG, which is, of course, actually a franchise of the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, with which Turkey is at war. So you run into the politics, and the politics spoils a lot of the nice ideas. This applies also, I must add, to the apparently much easier territory of southern Syria. Southern Syria, where the jihadis are much less strong, where the Jordanians are on the other side of the border, where surely the Jordanians would want to have a safe zone in the south. But the problem is this: if you talk to Jordanian officials today, what they're mainly interested in is peace and quiet. And if peace and quiet means that the Assad regime comes back to southern Syria, that the Syrian Arab army comes back to southern Syria, the Jordanians are increasingly okay with that. That's to say, they're less concerned about some newfangled idea of a safe zone which has to be defended from Assad or from Hezbollah or whoever else, and more concerned with the idea of no more refugees should come. And if that means the Assad regime comes back to the Nasib border crossing and to the border area, that's fine too. So again, one runs into the politics again and again. And one last notion which has been raised with regard to safe zones for refugees we should bear in mind, and this is kind of the opposite side to the proposal of cooperation with Turkey in Jarablus and Azaz, an idea raised by a researcher from Institute for Study of War in recent days, quite an influential think tank in this area. And what this researcher suggests is that a safe zone for refugees should be established in eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates. That's to say, as the American allied SDF destroy ISIS, and they're in the process of doing that, after they destroy ISIS, then a safe zone established there. Again, the politics come in. Well, that's all very well, but given that Turkey is a NATO ally in good standing and a strong partner of the West in various ways, problematic but strong partner in various ways, does the West particularly want to get into the job of partnering for a safe zone with a franchise or PKK organization? I'm not advocating anything here. I'm just saying when you get to try to get to solutions, you run into the politics of the war. And in this regard, just a couple of sentences to conclude to say the following. These are problems which are not going to be going away anytime soon. Many observers of the Syrian war do consider that there is a kind of shape emerging to its probable eventual conclusion, which was not there, let's say, a year and a half ago, deriving from the fact that the Russian entry into the war after September 30th, 2015, rendered the regime undestroyable, and that since then it's been all backwards for the rebellion. And there's a sense in which what may well remain of the war is a kind of wrapping up of the rebellion by the regime, the Iranians, and their various allies. But even if that assumption turns out to be correct, we're still a long, long, long way away from that being concluded. The rebellion still controls considerable parts of northwest and southwest Syria. ISIS and the Kurds, of course, control more or less the entirety of eastern Syria, and changing that, even if the regime intends to change it and how it would change it, remains very much into the future, which I'm afraid means that for the many millions of Syrian refugees currently either languishing outside of their country or as IDPs inside the country, the way home yet remains long. They're likely to remain refugees for some considerable years to come. And on that happy and uplifting after lunch note, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.